Called too embarrassing for his wedding, I cut off every transfer and took off at 30,000 feet, a silent counterattack that left them scrambling. When my grandson told me I was too old and embarrassing to attend his wedding, I smiled, nodded politely, and quietly made arrangements that would change everything. By the time they realized what I'd done, I was 30,000 feet in the air, sipping champagne in first class while they scrambled to save their crumbling financial empire. But that was just the beginning of my plan. You won't believe what happened when I landed. The crystal chandelier in my dining room cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table as I set down my teacup with trembling hands. Not from age, mind you, but from the sheer audacity of what I'd just heard. My daughter Sarah sat across from me, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming impatiently against her designer handbag, while her son Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the antique chair that had belonged to my great-grandmother. "Grandma Evelyn, you have to understand," Sarah began, her voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise over the past few years. "Marcus's wedding is going to be very sophisticated. The guest list includes some very important people from his firm, potential investors, people who matter in high society circles." I nodded slowly, my 78-year-old mind processing every calculated word. After building a business empire from nothing, after surviving the Great Recession when everyone said I'd lose everything, after proving wrong every man who told me women couldn't succeed in commercial real estate, I understood perfectly what she was really saying. What your mother is trying to explain," Marcus interrupted, straightening his expensive tie with the nervous energy of someone who'd never had to fight for anything in his life, "is that Victoria's family comes from very traditional old money. They have certain expectations about appearances, about the kind of people who should be at their events, the kind of people." I let those words settle in the air between us like poison gas. Here I was, the woman who had paid for Marcus's Harvard education, who had covered Sarah's mortgage when her husband's business failed, who had quietly funded their lifestyle for decades, being told I wasn't the right kind of people for their precious wedding. "I see," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. "And what exactly makes me the wrong kind of people, Marcus?" He had the decency to look ashamed, at least for a moment. "It's not that you're wrong, Grandma. It's just that you sometimes say things that are a bit too direct. And your stories about the old days, about working in construction and dealing with contractors, they might not resonate with Victoria's crowd." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with the kind of cruel excitement that comes from delivering a blow you think will go unanswered. "What Marcus is trying to say is that you embarrass us, Mother. Your loud voice, your habit of correcting people, your insistence on wearing those outdated clothes instead of something more appropriate for your age. Victoria's family will notice these things, and it will reflect poorly on our family's reputation." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, I could hear the gardener trimming the hedges around the fountain I'd had installed when Sarah graduated college. The same fountain she'd posed by for countless photographs, always making sure to tag the location so her friends would know she lived in the exclusive Riverside Estates neighborhood. "I embarrass you," I repeated slowly, tasting each word like bitter medicine. "The woman who built the company that paid for your education, your house, your cars, your vacations, your entire lifestyle embarrasses you." Marcus shifted again, his Harvard-educated brain finally recognizing the dangerous territory they'd wandered into. "Grandma, we're grateful for everything you've done. That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about exactly?" I asked, rising from my chair with the grace that 70 years of dealing with difficult men in boardrooms had taught me. "Because it sounds remarkably like you're telling me that my money is good enough for your lifestyle, but my presence isn't good enough for your wedding." Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating expression I'd seen her wear since she was 12 years old, and realized she could manipulate her father into buying her whatever she wanted. "Mother, you're being dramatic. We're simply asking you to consider what's best for everyone involved. Maybe you could take a nice vacation during the wedding. Go somewhere relaxing, somewhere you'd enjoy more than a stuffy society event. A vacation." They wanted to pay me to disappear so they could enjoy the fruits of my labor without the embarrassment of acknowledging where their wealth had come from. I looked around the dining room at the oil paintings I'd collected over decades, at the Persian rug that had cost more than most people's cars, at the china cabinet filled with antiques that represented not just money, but taste, refinement, and an appreciation for beauty that apparently my own family couldn't recognize. And where exactly would you suggest I go for this vacation? I asked, my voice carrying the dangerous calm that had once made grown men in three-piece suits reconsider their negotiating positions. There's a lovely assisted living facility in Scottsdale, Sarah said quickly, as if she'd been waiting for this opening. Very upscale, very comfortable. They have activities, social groups, people your own age who you might have more in common with. Marcus nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that his mother had found a way to frame their rejection as concern for my well-being. It would just be temporary, of course, just until after the wedding and honeymoon. Maybe a month or two to let you settle in and see if you like it. I walked to the window, looking out at the grounds I'd carefully landscaped, at the tennis court where I still played twice a week despite my age, at the swimming pool where Marcus had learned to swim during the countless summers he'd spent at my house while his parents traveled for business. Business trips I'd funded, I might add. A month or two, I said thoughtfully. And then what? I come back here to my home and we pretend this conversation never happened? We go back to family dinners where you tolerate my presence while spending my money? Mother, please don't make this more difficult than it has to be, Sarah said, her voice taking on the whining quality that had driven her father to distraction. We're trying to find a solution that works for everyone. I turned back to face them, these two people who shared my blood but apparently none of my backbone. You know what? You're absolutely right. We do need a solution that works for everyone. Relief flooded both their faces. They thought they'd won, thought they'd successfully manipulated the old woman into accepting their terms. How little they understood about the person who had built an empire by never accepting anyone else's terms. I'll make some calls this afternoon, I continued, watching hope bloom in their eyes. I'll arrange for an extended vacation, somewhere far away where I won't embarrass you or interfere with your important social climbing. Marcus actually smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd shown since walking into my house. Thank you, Grandma. I know this isn't easy, but it really is for the best. Oh, I'm sure it will be, I agreed, already calculating the moves I'd need to make. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have quite a few arrangements to handle before I leave. They gathered their things quickly, eager to escape before I could change my mind. Sarah kissed my cheek with the perfunctory affection she'd learned to fake over the years, while Marcus squeezed my shoulder with what he probably thought was reassuring pressure. We'll check on the house while you're gone, Sarah promised as they headed toward the door. Make sure everything stays in good condition. I watched them climb into Marcus's BMW, the one I'd helped him buy when he graduated law school, and drive away down the circular driveway I'd had paved with imported Italian stone. They were probably already on their phones, calling Victoria with the good news that the embarrassing grandmother had been successfully managed and would be safely tucked away during their precious wedding. But as I walked back into my study and opened my laptop, I was making very different plans. They wanted me gone. They wanted to be free of the burden of acknowledging where their money came from. They were about to get exactly what they asked for, in ways they could never imagine. I pulled up my contact list and began scrolling through names accumulated over 50 years in business. Lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, real estate agents, private jet services. People who understood that money talks, and when Evelyn Morrison called, they listened very carefully. The first call was to my attorney, Jonathan Walsh, who'd been handling my legal affairs for over 20 years. Jonathan, I need to make some immediate changes to my estate planning. Yes, I know it's short notice. No, this can't wait until next week. The second call was to my financial advisor at Goldman Sachs. Patricia, I want to liquidate several positions immediately. The rental properties in downtown, the shopping center in Westfield, the office building on 5th Street. Everything needs to move quickly. The third call was to Harrison Private Jets. This is Evelyn Morrison. I need to book an extended trip departing tomorrow if possible. International destinations, first-class accommodations throughout. Money is no object. As I made call after call, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of taking decisive action, of refusing to be anyone's victim, of reminding the world that Evelyn Morrison didn't just disappear quietly when people decided she was inconvenient. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Thanks for being so understanding, Mom. This really is for the best. Love you. I smiled as I typed back, "You're absolutely right, darling. This is going to be perfect for everyone involved." What they didn't know yet was that I'd spent 5 decades building multiple streams of income, creating financial structures they'd never even heard of, establishing relationships with people who could make things happen with a single phone call. They thought they were dealing with a doddering old woman who would gratefully accept their crumbs of affection. They were about to discover they'd just declared war on someone who had been winning battles since before they were born. By 6 o'clock that evening, I was reviewing documents spread across my dining room table like a general planning a military campaign. Each paper represented years of careful investment, decades of building wealth that my family had grown so comfortable with, they'd forgotten it wasn't their birthright. The doorbell rang as I signed the final authorization to liquidate my portfolio. Through the security monitor, I could see a courier in a crisp uniform holding an envelope marked urgent. I buzzed him in, my pulse quickening with anticipation. "Mrs. Morrison, I have a delivery requiring your signature." The envelope contained confirmation of everything I'd set in motion. Flight manifest for tomorrow's departure to Monaco aboard a Gulfstream G650. Reservations at the Hotel Hermitage Monte Carlo, Presidential Suite, indefinite stay. Most importantly, documentation showing the successful transfer of $12 million from my various accounts into an untraceable offshore trust. I poured myself a glass of the Chateau Margaux that Marcus had given me for my birthday, probably using my own money without realizing it, and settled into my favorite chair to admire my handiwork. The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd essentially paid for their own exile from my fortune. My phone rang. Sarah's number flashed on the screen. "Mother, I just wanted to call and tell you how proud I am of how you handled everything today. I know it wasn't easy, but you're making the right choice." "Oh, sweetheart," I said, savoring the wine and the moment equally. "I couldn't agree more. I'm making exactly the right choice." "Have you had a chance to look into that facility in Scottsdale? I found their website and it looks absolutely lovely. They have a pool, organized activities, even a library." I almost laughed. A library? As if I hadn't spent the last 50 years building libraries worth of knowledge about finance, real estate, and human nature. As if I needed their permission to read books in my twilight years. "Actually, I've decided on something a bit more adventurous," I said, watching the sunset paint my gardens gold through the French doors. "I'm going to Europe for an extended stay, maybe indefinitely." A pause. I could practically hear the wheels turning in her calculating mind. "Europe? Mother, that sounds expensive, and so far away. What if something happens to you? What if you get sick?" "Don't worry about the expense, dear. I've made arrangements." The understatement of the century, but she didn't need to know that yet. "What kind of arrangements? Mother, you can't just disappear to Europe without proper planning. What about your medications, your doctor, your financial obligations here?" Financial obligations. She meant the monthly transfers that had been funding their lifestyle for so long, they'd started thinking of my money as their money. The payments that covered Marcus's car lease, Sarah's country club membership, the private school tuition for grandchildren I apparently wasn't suitable to be seen with in public. "Everything's been handled," I assured her. "My attorney has power of attorney for any urgent matters. My financial advisor will manage the remaining investments. As for my health, European healthcare is quite advanced these days." "Remaining investments?" Sarah's voice sharpened with the first hint of genuine alarm. "What do you mean by remaining?" "Well, I certainly can't travel indefinitely without liquid capital," I said reasonably. "I've liquidated several positions to fund this adventure. After all, you said yourself that I should take a nice vacation somewhere I'd enjoy." The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "How several positions?" "Oh, just some rental properties, a few commercial buildings. Nothing that affects the house, of course." "Yet," I added silently, though she couldn't hear that part. "Mother, those properties generate income. Monthly income that helps with the family expenses, the house maintenance, our financial planning." Our financial planning. There it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. They hadn't just grown accustomed to my money, they'd started counting on it as part of their own financial strategy. "I'm sure you and Marcus will figure something out," I said with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they'd figure out. After all, he's a successful attorney, and you've always been so resourceful. Another pause, longer this time. I could picture Sarah's face, that calculating expression she wore when she realized a situation wasn't going according to her carefully laid plans. "When exactly are you leaving?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, actually. I managed to book a last-minute flight." Last minute if you considered 3 hours of phone calls with private aviation services last minute. But why burden her with details? "Tomorrow. Mother, this is incredibly sudden. Marcus and I should drive over tonight so we can see you off properly." I smiled, remembering how they'd sat in my dining room just hours earlier, explaining why my presence would be an embarrassment to their social climbing ambitions. Now, suddenly, they wanted to see me off properly. "That's sweet of you to offer, but I'll be leaving quite early. 6 a.m. departure, you know how airports are these days." Well, private airfields, but again, details. 6 a.m. from which airport? Maybe we could meet you there just to make sure you're settled properly. The concern in her voice was almost touching. If I hadn't known it had nothing to do with my welfare, and everything to do with the growing realization that their financial safety net was about to disappear into European skies. "I'd rather handle the departure myself," I said firmly. "At my age, emotional goodbyes just make everything more difficult. But Mother, we need to discuss some practical matters. The house, the accounts, the monthly arrangements we've had in place." Monthly arrangements. Such a delicate way to describe decades of financial dependency dressed up as family obligation. "I've left detailed instructions with Jonathan Walsh. He'll handle any questions you might have about ongoing arrangements." What I didn't mention was that those instructions primarily involved discontinuing all the ongoing arrangements, but Sarah would discover that soon enough. I should call him tonight then, just to make sure everything's clear. "I wouldn't," I said quickly. "He's handling several urgent matters for me this evening. Very complex international financial transfers, you understand. I'd hate for you to interrupt something so time-sensitive." The truth was that Jonathan was probably at home with his wife, enjoying a quiet dinner while the automated systems processed the wire transfers that would soon make my family's financial situation much more interesting. "Mother, I'm getting the feeling there's something you're not telling me." "Nonsense, dear. I'm simply taking your advice and removing myself from situations where I might embarrass you. Isn't this exactly what you wanted?" "I never said you should disappear to Europe indefinitely. I suggested a short vacation, maybe a few weeks." "Well, at my age, who knows how long indefinitely might be? Could be weeks, could be months, could be years. The adventure is in not knowing, don't you think?" I could hear her breathing change, that sharp intake that meant her carefully controlled facade was starting to crack. "Years? Mother, you can't be serious. What about Marcus's wedding? What about the holidays? What about family obligations?" Family obligations. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. I thought about all the family obligations I'd met over the decades, while they'd met exactly none of theirs. "Oh, I'm sure you'll manage the holidays beautifully without me. After all, you made it quite clear that my presence isn't really welcome at family celebrations." "That's not what we said." "Isn't it? Because from where I was sitting, it sounded remarkably like you were saying I was too embarrassing, too inappropriate, too much of a liability to be seen with the kind of people you want to impress." "Mother, you're twisting our words." "Am I? Because I have quite a good memory for someone my age. Marcus specifically said I wasn't the right kind of people for his wedding. You specifically said I embarrass you. Those seem like fairly unambiguous statements." The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This was the silence of someone realizing they'd miscalculated badly, that the person they thought they could manipulate and dismiss had been listening far more carefully than they'd assumed. "We were just trying to avoid any awkwardness," Sarah said finally, her voice smaller now, less certain. "Well, mission accomplished," I replied cheerfully. "There won't be any awkwardness at all, because I won't be there to create it. But the financial arrangements, Mother. We need to discuss the practical aspects of your being away for an extended period." And there it was, the real reason for her sudden concern about my welfare. Not worry about my health or safety in a foreign country, but worry about their monthly allowance from the Bank of Evelyn. "I'm sure everything will work out exactly as it should," I said, finishing the last of my wine. "After all, you're both such capable, independent adults. I have complete faith in your ability to handle your own financial affairs. Mother, please, can we at least talk about this in person before you leave? Can't you delay the trip just one day so we can sit down and discuss everything properly? I looked around my beautiful home, at the life I'd built with my own hands and my own determination, at the legacy I'd thought I was preserving for people who apparently found me too embarrassing to acknowledge in public. I'm afraid that's impossible, dear. The arrangements are all final, non-refundable, you understand. Which was true in a sense. The arrangements I had made were indeed final, though not in the way she imagined. Then at least tell me where you'll be staying. What if there's an emergency? What if we need to reach you? I'll be in touch when I'm settled, I promised, which was also true. I'd definitely be in touch when I was comfortably settled in Monaco, sipping champagne on my terrace while they figured out how to pay their own bills for the first time in decades. Mother, I love you. We both love you. We just want what's best for everyone. I know you do, sweetheart, and that's exactly what you're going to get. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my study, surrounded by the detritus of a lifetime of financial planning that had somehow become a lifetime of enabling ungrateful children. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 50 years building wealth to secure my family's future, only to discover they saw me as an obstacle to their social aspirations rather than the architect of their comfortable existence. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the evening, first from Sarah, then from Marcus, each message more frantic than the last as the reality of their situation began to crystallize. Mom, we should really talk before you leave. Grandma, maybe we were too hasty about the wedding situation. Mother, please call me back immediately. I ignored them all and instead made one final call to Patricia at Goldman Sachs. The transfers are complete, Mrs. Morrison. $12.7 million has been moved to the Cayman accounts as requested. The remaining domestic holdings have been liquidated as instructed. Is there anything else you need before your departure? Just confirmation that the monthly automatic transfers have been canceled, I said, signing the last of the documents my attorney had couriered over. All standing orders terminated as of midnight tonight. The accounts feeding those transfers have been closed. Your family members will receive notification letters tomorrow afternoon, after your departure window. Perfect timing. By the time they realized the full scope of what had happened, I'd be somewhere over the Atlantic, beyond the reach of their manipulation and crocodile tears. I spent my final evening in the house, walking through rooms filled with memories, touching surfaces I'd polished with pride, admiring artwork I'd collected not for investment, but for beauty. This house had been my sanctuary, my proof that a woman could build something magnificent in a world designed to keep her small. Now, it felt like a mausoleum, a monument to relationships that had died long before I'd been brave enough to acknowledge their passing. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom one last time. Tomorrow would bring either liberation or the most expensive midlife crisis in family history. Either way, it would be entirely my choice, made on my terms, funded by my money. My alarm sounded at 4:30 a.m., though I'd been awake for hours, mind racing with anticipation and something that felt remarkably like relief. I dressed carefully in my favorite Chanel suit, the navy one with pearl buttons that Sarah always said made me look too formal for casual occasions. Today felt like the most important occasion of my life, so formal seemed entirely appropriate. The car service arrived precisely at 5:15, a black Mercedes that glided through empty streets toward Teterboro Airport. No commercial terminals, no security lines, no crowds of people who might witness an old woman's dramatic exit from a life that no longer fit. The driver, a professional who understood that wealthy clients paid for discretion as much as transportation, made no attempt at conversation during the 40-minute drive. Teterboro at dawn was a different world from the chaos of commercial aviation. Private jets lined the tarmac like sleeping birds, their sleek forms promising escape to anywhere money could reach. My Gulfstream G650 waited with engines already warming, cabin lights glowing invitingly in the pre-dawn darkness. Captain Rodriguez met me at the steps, a woman about Sarah's age with the confident bearing that comes from controlling million-dollar aircraft rather than manipulating family members. Good morning, Mrs. Morrison. Welcome aboard. We'll have you in Monaco by early evening local time. The cabin was everything the charter service had promised. Cream leather seats that converted to beds, a dining area set with actual china, windows large enough to watch the world shrink to insignificance below. I settled into my seat and accepted a glass of Dom Perignon from the flight attendant, a young man whose smile seemed genuinely warm rather than professionally calculated. "First time flying private?" he asked, adjusting my seat controls. "First time doing anything this dramatic," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. "I'm 78 years old, and I just made the most expensive decision of my life." "Sometimes the most expensive decisions turn out to be the most valuable," he said, wisdom that seemed too profound for someone barely out of college. "Enjoy the flight, Mrs. Morrison. Monaco is beautiful this time of year." As we taxied toward takeoff, my phone exploded with calls. Sarah's ringtone, then Marcus's, then numbers I didn't recognize, but assumed were other family members who'd been recruited for the campaign to talk sense into the crazy old woman. I turned the phone off and slipped it into my purse, watching the lights of New York fade beneath us as we climbed toward cruising altitude. The flight attendant brought breakfast on bone china plates that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Eggs Benedict with hollandaise that would have made Julia Child weep, fresh fruit that had never seen the inside of a supermarket, coffee that tasted like liquid luxury. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, and the knowledge that for the first time in decades, I was spending money on myself without calculating how it would affect anyone else's budget. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I opened my laptop and logged into my bank accounts, curious to see how quickly the financial dominoes would fall. The domestic accounts showed exactly what I'd expected: zero balances across the board. The offshore accounts showed numbers that still made me dizzy despite having authorized every transfer myself. $12.7 million, earning interest in currencies my family had never heard of, managed by advisors who spoke 5 languages and understood that money was a tool for independence, not a leash for obligation. I drafted an email to Jonathan Walsh, my attorney, with instructions for the next phase of my plan. The house would go on the market immediately, priced for quick sale to investors who appreciated quality construction and prime location. The furnishings would be sold at auction, except for specific pieces I wanted shipped to Monaco once I'd settled permanently. The cars could be sold or donated to charity, whatever would create the cleanest break from my previous life. The most important instruction was about communication with my family. All contact should go through his office. He was authorized to provide my general location and confirm my well-being, but no specific address, no financial information, no details about my plans or timeline for return. If they wanted to repair our relationship, they could start by learning to respect boundaries instead of assuming access to my resources was their birthright. 6 hours into the flight, we hit turbulence over the mid-Atlantic. Nothing dangerous, just enough to remind passengers that flying was still an act of faith in physics and engineering. I watched other passengers grip their armrests and exchange nervous glances, but I felt oddly calm. After 78 years of playing it safe, of making responsible decisions and putting family needs before personal desires, a little turbulence felt like freedom. The captain's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the rough air and promising smoother conditions ahead. I smiled at the metaphor. My life had certainly hit some rough air, but I had faith that smoother conditions lay ahead, somewhere on the French Riviera where my money could buy solitude and my age could buy wisdom instead of dismissal. My phone buzzed with notifications even though I'd turned it off. The miracle of modern technology meant messages could queue up like angry creditors, waiting to assault me the moment I reconnected to the world. I could see the preview of Sarah's latest text through the lock screen. "Mother, please call. We found out about the accounts. We can work this out. We can work this out." The same phrase she'd used when her husband's business failed and she needed me to cover their mortgage. The same words Marcus had spoken when he'd needed help with law school tuition. Always we when they needed something. Always you when explaining why my presence was inappropriate for their social climbing. I deleted the message without reading it fully and returned my attention to the view outside my window. Clouds stretched to every horizon like a white ocean, beautiful and untouchable from 38,000 feet. Below those clouds lay the life I was leaving behind, the roles and expectations and relationships that had gradually constricted until I could barely breathe. Above the clouds was possibility. Monaco meant casinos where I could gamble my own money for my own entertainment, art galleries where I could buy paintings because they moved me, not because they matched the decor, restaurants where I could eat alone or with strangers who knew nothing about my embarrassing tendency to speak my mind, hotels where the staff would call me Madame Morrison and mean it as respect rather than barely concealed impatience. The flight attendant refreshed my champagne and mentioned that we'd be beginning our descent into Nice in 2 hours. From there, a helicopter would take me directly to Monaco, because apparently when you spend enough money, even geography becomes negotiable. I'd never ridden in a helicopter, another first to add to a life that had suddenly become full of new experiences. "Any regrets about leaving?" he asked, probably reading something in my expression that I hadn't intended to reveal. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret leaving behind the house I'd built, the community where I'd established myself, the family relationships I'd nurtured for decades? Did I regret liquidating assets it had taken 50 years to accumulate, all to prove a point about respect and dignity? "Ask me in 6 months," I said finally. "Right now I'm too excited to have regrets." And it was true. Despite the magnitude of what I'd done, despite the bridges I'd burned and the security I'd abandoned, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of constantly managing other people's feelings, of funding other people's dreams while putting my own on hold, of accepting scraps of affection in exchange for unlimited financial support, had lifted somewhere over the Atlantic. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from a number I didn't recognize, probably Marcus trying to reach me through a friend's phone. I let it go to voicemail and instead called the concierge at the Hotel Hermitage to confirm my arrival arrangements. The presidential suite would be ready, champagne chilled, dinner reservations made at the restaurant of my choice. They asked no questions about family or background, only how they could make my stay more comfortable. That's what money could buy when spent without apology or justification. Not just luxury, but the luxury of being treated as if your preferences mattered, as if your comfort was worth someone's attention and effort. I'd forgotten what that felt like, had grown so accustomed to negotiating for basic respect within my own family that I'd accepted their dismissive treatment as normal. The pilot announced our initial descent into Nice, and I pressed my face to the window like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. The Mediterranean sparkled blue-green in the afternoon sun, dotted with yachts that looked like toys from our altitude. The coastline curved in elegant arcs, white buildings climbing hillsides like ambitious flowers reaching toward light. Monaco appeared as we descended, a tiny principality glittering with wealth and possibility. Casinos and hotels and apartment buildings that cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries. A playground for people who'd learned that money was meant to be enjoyed, not hoarded out of fear or guilt or obligation to ungrateful relatives. The helicopter ride from Nice to Monaco took 15 minutes and felt like crossing into another world. Below us, highways clogged with traffic while we soared above it all, privileged and untouchable. The pilot pointed out landmarks, the famous casino, the palace, the harbor, filled with yachts that served as floating palaces for people who'd discovered what I was just learning. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is to stop enabling their worst impulses. Sometimes respect has to be earned rather than assumed. And sometimes the only way to teach people your value is to remove yourself from their reach and let them discover what life costs without your subsidies. The Hotel Hermitage rose before us like a Belle Epoque dream, all ornate facades and manicured gardens. As we settled onto the helipad, I could see staff members already approaching with the kind of efficient deference that money commands when it's spent confidently rather than apologetically. My adventure was just beginning, but already I knew I'd made the right choice. Somewhere behind me, across an ocean and several time zones, my family was probably discovering what their monthly budget looked like without my contributions. They were learning that respect and love weren't the same thing, that financial support could end as suddenly as it had begun, but that was their lesson to learn. Mine was just beginning, at 38,000 feet above the Mediterranean, with champagne in my glass and possibilities stretching to every horizon. The helicopter's rotors wound down as I stepped onto the helipad of the Hotel Hermitage, my heels clicking against polished stone that probably cost more than most people's cars. The staff moved with choreographed precision, whisking away my luggage while a woman in an impeccable uniform approached with a silver tray bearing a glass of champagne and what appeared to be caviar on mother-of-pearl spoons. "Madame Morrison, welcome to Monaco. I am Gabrielle, your personal concierge during your stay. The presidential suite has been prepared to your specifications." I accepted the champagne, noting how different it tasted when served without guilt or justification. Back home, opening a bottle of Dom Perignon had always come with Sarah's commentary about extravagant spending or Marcus's lectures about financial responsibility. Here, it was simply Tuesday afternoon refreshment for someone who could afford to drink liquid luxury without explaining herself to anyone. The elevator to the presidential suite was lined with mirrors and gold leaf, rising through floors that housed other wealthy individuals who'd learned what I was discovering. That money spent on yourself feels remarkably different from money spent to buy other people's approval. The doors opened to reveal a suite that made my substantial home look modest by comparison. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Mediterranean, where yachts worth more than small countries bobbed gently in the harbor. The furnishings were museum quality, the kind of antiques I'd admired in galleries but never dared purchase because Sarah always had opinions about practical spending. Fresh flowers arranged with artistic precision filled crystal vases, their fragrance mixing with the salt air that drifted through open French doors. "Your dinner reservation at Joël Robuchon is confirmed for 8:30, Gabrielle informed me, setting down an itinerary written on paper so heavy it felt substantial in my hands. "The casino has prepared a private gaming room should you wish to try your luck this evening, and tomorrow the yacht Serenity awaits your pleasure for a cruise along the Italian coast." A private yacht. I'd never even considered such extravagance, had spent decades telling myself that money was for security, not indulgence. But standing in that opulent suite, watching the sun paint the Mediterranean gold, I realized security was exactly what I'd bought. Security from judgment, from obligation, from the exhausting performance of being grateful for scraps of affection from people who saw me as an embarrassment. My phone had been buzzing continuously since landing, a symphony of desperation that I finally decided to acknowledge. 17 missed calls from Sarah, 12 from Marcus, and messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years who'd apparently been recruited for the intervention campaign. I scrolled through the previews without opening the full messages. "Mom, the bank called about the accounts." "Grandma, we need to talk immediately." "Mrs. Morrison, this is regarding urgent family matters." Each message more frantic than the last as the reality of their situation crystallized. The most recent was from Sarah, sent just minutes ago. "Mother, I know you're angry, but this affects everyone. Marcus can't make his mortgage payment. I can't cover the country club dues. We found lawyers who say this might be elder abuse, taking advantage of your emotional state. Elder abuse." I almost laughed at the audacity. 78 years of making sharp business decisions, of building an empire from nothing, of proving my mental acuity in boardrooms full of men who underestimated me. And now, suddenly, I was too emotionally compromised to control my own money, but only when my decisions affected their comfort level. I walked to the terrace, champagne in hand, and dialed Jonathan Walsh's direct line. He answered on the first ring, probably expecting this call. "Evelyn, I trust you arrived safely. How's Monaco treating you?" "Like royalty, which is exactly what I needed. Tell me, how are my former dependents adjusting to their new financial reality?" Jonathan's chuckle carried across the international connection. "About as well as you'd expect. Sarah called my office 6 times this morning. Marcus showed up demanding to see your files. I've had to explain attorney-client privilege more times today than in my entire previous career. And their threats about elder abuse? Empty legal posturing from people who've never had to fight for anything. Your mental competency is documented extensively. The transfers were executed over multiple days with proper legal oversight. Most importantly, you're spending your own money on yourself, which is the opposite of abuse." Through the terrace doors, I could hear Gabrielle arranging tomorrow's activities with someone who sounded like a yacht captain, discussing weather conditions and preferred destinations, as if my comfort was the most important consideration in the world. When had anyone in my family last considered my preferences without calculating the cost? "There's something else," Jonathan continued. Marcus called his law firm's senior partner, apparently trying to pressure me through professional channels. The partner called me directly to apologize for his associate's inappropriate behavior. Seems they're reviewing Marcus's position with the firm. What does that mean exactly? It means throwing around legal threats about your mental competency while trying to access your financial information has consequences. Professional consequences. I sipped my champagne and watched the sun sink lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have made Maria cry with their beauty. My late husband had always said money was a tool, not a destination. It had taken me 78 years to understand. He meant it was a tool for creating the life you wanted, not the life other people expected you to fund. Have you heard anything about the house sale? 3 offers above asking price in the first day. Apparently your neighborhood is quite desirable when people aren't expected to subsidize the current owner's extended family. The house I'd built with my own vision and determination, filled with furniture I'd chosen and artwork I'd collected, would become someone else's dream home. Someone who would appreciate the craftsmanship without taking it for granted. Someone who would fill those rooms with laughter that wasn't preceded by requests for money. Accept the highest offer, I decided. I want a clean break. Already done. Closing is set for next week. The buyers are paying cash, no contingencies. They specifically mentioned admiring the quality of construction and asking if the builder was available for other projects. If they only knew the builder was currently drinking champagne on a Monaco terrace, having traded her hammer for a passport and her responsibilities for possibilities. My phone buzzed with another call. Marcus this time, probably calling from some borrowed phone since I'd blocked his number. I let it ring while Jonathan filled me in on other details. The cars had been sold to a collector who specialized in well-maintained luxury vehicles. The furniture auction was scheduled for the weekend, with several pieces already generating serious interest from dealers who recognized quality. What about my personal items, the photo albums, Maria's jewelry? Shipped to a storage facility in Nice, as requested. You can retrieve them whenever you're ready, or have them forwarded to your permanent address once you've decided where that might be. Permanent address? The phrase carried weight I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I could choose where to live based purely on my own preferences. No considerations about school districts for grandchildren who found me embarrassing. No calculations about proximity to family members who saw my presence as a social liability. Jonathan, what would you do if you were 78 years old with more money than you could spend and complete freedom to go anywhere? I'd probably ask my friend Evelyn Morrison for advice, since she seems to have figured out something the rest of us missed. After hanging up, I stood on the terrace watching Monaco come alive in the gathering dusk. Lights flickered on in casino windows where people with more money than sense would soon be losing fortunes on games of chance. Restaurants prepared for evening crowds who ordered wine by the bottle without checking prices. Shops displayed jewelry that cost more than most people's houses, their windows glowing like treasure chests. But the real treasure was simpler than any of that luxury. It was the silence in my phone when I turned off the ringer, the absence of guilt when I ordered room service for one, the freedom to plan tomorrow based on my own desires rather than other people's emergencies. Gabrielle knocked softly on the suite door, entering with the evening's itinerary and a question about transportation preferences. Did I prefer the Rolls-Royce or the Bentley for dinner tonight? Would I like the casino to prepare specific games, or did I prefer to explore their offerings spontaneously? Actually, I said, surprising myself with the decision, cancel the dinner reservation. I'd like to eat here tonight on the terrace watching the harbor lights. Of course, madame. The chef can prepare anything you desire, perhaps the bouillabaisse with locally caught fish, or the lamb from the hills of Provence. I chose the bouillabaisse, not because it was expensive or impressive, but because I'd never tried it and wanted to taste something new. How long had it been since I'd made a choice based purely on curiosity rather than obligation or expectation? Dinner arrived as the last light faded from the western sky, served on china so fine it was almost translucent. The bouillabaisse was a revelation, complex and satisfying in ways that had nothing to do with its cost, and everything to do with the care that had gone into its preparation. I ate slowly, savoring each spoonful while watching yachts navigate the harbor like floating palaces. My phone remained silent on the side table, its screen dark with ignored messages. Somewhere across an ocean, my family was probably gathered around someone's kitchen table, calculating how much money they'd lost and strategizing ways to guilt me into returning. They were learning that dependency was a choice, not a birthright, and that respect couldn't be purchased with monthly allowances. But that was their education to complete. Mine was just beginning, here on a terrace overlooking the Mediterranean, with possibilities stretching to every horizon and money that was finally, truly, mine to spend as I chose. The casino called just as I finished dinner, a polite inquiry about whether I planned to visit their gaming rooms tonight. I'd never gambled more than $20 in my life, had always considered it financially irresponsible. But sitting in that presidential suite, with more money than I could spend and no one to answer to but myself, irresponsibility felt like the most reasonable choice I'd made in years. "Prepare a private table," I said. "I think it's time I learned to take some risks." The casino's private gaming room felt like stepping into a movie about the lives of people who'd never worried about mortgage payments or grocery budgets. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over green felt tables, while dealers in crisp white shirts moved cards with the precision of surgeons. The room smelled of expensive cologne and possibility. "Madame Morrison," the casino host greeted me with a bow that would have made European royalty feel welcome. "We've prepared the baccarat table as requested. Your credit line has been established at $500,000. $500,000. 6 months ago, that number would have sent me into cardiac arrest. Tonight, it represented less than 4% of my liquid assets, money I could afford to lose without affecting my security or comfort. The freedom was intoxicating. I'd chosen baccarat because it seemed appropriately dramatic for my first night as a woman who gambled with house money. The dealer, an elegant woman about my age who introduced herself as Madame Dubois, explained the rules with patient precision. Unlike my family's recent explanations of why I was socially inadequate, her instruction came without condescension or impatience. "The beauty of baccarat," she said, shuffling cards with practiced grace, "is that it requires no skill, only courage, perfect for someone beginning a new adventure." My first bet was conservative by the standards of this room, but revolutionary by the standards of my previous life. $10,000 on the banker's hand, enough money to fund Marcus's monthly lifestyle for 3 months. The cards fell with whispered authority against the felt. Banker won. $20,000 appeared in my chip stack like magic. "Beginner's luck," Madame Dubois observed with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased rather than professionally required. "Perhaps you should consider a larger wager." I doubled my bet, then doubled it again. Within an hour, I was playing with house money and experiencing something I'd never felt in 7 decades of careful financial planning. The pure adrenaline rush of risk without consequence, of decisions made for pleasure rather than security. My phone buzzed insistently from my purse, but I ignored it. Whatever crisis my family had manufactured tonight could wait. I was learning that money spent on myself created entirely different emotions than money spent on other people's emergencies. This money bought excitement, anticipation, the delicious uncertainty of outcomes beyond my control. "You play like someone who's never been afraid of losing," observed a gentleman at the neighboring table, his accent suggesting old European money rather than new American wealth. "I'm learning," I replied, placing another bet with hands steadier than they'd been in months. Apparently, I spent too many years being afraid of the wrong things. By midnight, I was ahead nearly $200,000 and feeling more alive than I had since Maria's death. The chips stacked in front of me represented more than money. They were proof that taking risks could yield rewards, that stepping outside comfortable boundaries could lead to extraordinary experiences. The casino host approached with champagne and gentle suggestion that perhaps I'd like to continue tomorrow when I was fresh. I accepted both the drink and the advice, cashing out my winnings with the satisfaction of someone who'd discovered a new talent for living dangerously. Back in my suite, I finally checked my phone. 43 missed calls, dozens of text messages, and 3 voicemails that grew progressively more desperate. Sarah's latest message, sent an hour ago, contained words I'd never expected to read. "Mom, I'm sorry, we made a mistake. Please come home so we can fix this. Too late for apologies that were motivated by financial panic rather than genuine remorse. I'd spent decades accepting half-hearted expressions of gratitude delivered only when they needed something. Tonight, I'd learned what it felt like to be appreciated without strings attached, to have my preferences matter simply because I could afford to make them matter. I opened my laptop and began researching something I'd never considered before. Permanent residency in Monaco for foreign nationals with substantial assets. The requirements were straightforward for someone with my resources. Proof of financial independence, clean criminal background, willingness to maintain a primary residence in the Principality. The application process would take months, but I had nothing but time and money to spend on creating exactly the life I wanted. No more family dinners where I was tolerated rather than welcomed. No more requests for emergency funding disguised as loving concern. No more explanations required for how I chose to spend money I'd earned through 50 years of smart decisions and hard work. The next morning brought sunshine that painted the Mediterranean gold and a knock at my sweet door. Gabriel arrived with breakfast, newspapers in 3 languages, and an itinerary that made me feel like royalty planning a royal tour. "The yacht Serenity awaits your pleasure at 10 o'clock, she announced, setting down coffee that smelled like liquid heaven. Captain Morrison has planned a route along the Italian coast, with stops in Portofino and the Cinque Terre if weather permits." Captain Morrison. No relation, just coincidence, but the name felt like a good omen. I dressed carefully in white linen pants and a silk blouse that Sarah had always criticized as too youthful for someone my age. Today, I felt exactly the right age for adventure. The Serenity was everything the name promised. A 100-foot yacht with crew quarters, dining areas, and a master suite that rivaled my hotel accommodations. The captain, a weathered man with kind eyes and a British accent, welcomed me aboard with the respect due a paying customer, rather than the tolerance reserved for aging relatives. "First time on a private yacht, Mrs. Morrison?" "First time doing most things," I admitted, accepting a mimosa from a crew member who looked genuinely happy to serve it. "I'm making up for decades of playing it safe." We cruised along coastlines that belonged on postcards, past villages clinging to cliffsides like determined flowers. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly blue, dotted with other yachts carrying other people who'd learned that money was meant to create experiences rather than security blankets for ungrateful families. My phone remained silent in my purse. I'd turned off international roaming after checking my messages that morning, cutting the electronic umbilical cord that had kept me tethered to people who valued my bank account more than my presence. The last message had been from Marcus, sent at 3 a.m. "Grandma, I know you're hurt. I know we handled everything wrong, but disappearing isn't the answer. We need to talk about practical matters. The wedding is in 2 weeks and people are asking questions." People were asking questions, not about my well-being or happiness, but about how to explain my absence to their social circle. The embarrassment they'd wanted to avoid by excluding me had been replaced by the embarrassment of explaining why their financial benefactor had vanished along with her support. Lunch was served on the yacht's forward deck, fresh seafood caught that morning by local fishermen who sold their catch to restaurants that charged more for a single meal than most families spent on groceries in a week. I ate slowly, tasting flavors I'd never experienced while watching dolphins play in our wake. "You seem remarkably relaxed for someone who just made such a dramatic life change," observed Dr. Williams, a retired physician from London who was also chartering the yacht for the week. We'd struck up a conversation over aperitifs, 2 people who'd discovered that money spent on yourself created entirely different experiences than money spent on obligation. "I'm 78 years old," I replied, watching the Italian coastline slide past like a moving painting. "I spent 50 years building wealth and 40 years sharing it with people who forgot to be grateful. This is the first time I've spent money purely for my own pleasure. And how does it feel?" I considered the question while sipping wine that cost more per bottle than I used to spend on monthly groceries. Like I've been living someone else's life and finally remembered my own name. That evening, as we anchored in a secluded cove near Portofino, I made a decision that would have terrified the woman I'd been 6 months ago. I called the concierge at the Hotel Hermitage and extended my stay indefinitely. Not a week, not a month, but indefinitely, with the understanding that my suite would remain available as long as I wished to occupy it. The cost was astronomical by normal standards, reasonable by the standards of someone who'd stopped funding other people's lifestyles. More importantly, it was mine to spend without justification, explanation, or guilt. 2 weeks later, I was sitting on my terrace reading the international edition of the Wall Street Journal when an article in the social pages caught my attention. Prominent attorney's wedding. Postponed indefinitely due to family circumstances. The accompanying photo showed Marcus and Victoria looking appropriately devastated outside what appeared to be an expensive wedding venue. The article was carefully worded to avoid specifics, but I could read between the diplomatic lines. Family circumstances meant they couldn't afford the wedding they'd planned. The venue that had been paid for with deposits from my account was no longer available to them. The embarrassing grandmother they'd excluded had taken her embarrassing money with her. I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but genuine sadness for people who'd confused love with financial dependency. They'd had access to real wealth, not just money, but the kind of emotional security that comes from unconditional family support. Instead of treasuring it, they'd taken it for granted until it disappeared. My phone, now equipped with a new Monaco number that my family didn't possess, rang with a call from Jonathan Walsh. I'd given him permission to share my general location with family members, though not my specific contact information. "They want to visit," he said without preamble. "Sarah and Marcus. They're talking about flying to Monaco to apologize in person." "What did you tell them?" "That you're unavailable for visitors at this time. That if they want to communicate, it needs to be through proper channels with advance notice." "Good. I'm not ready to see them yet. Maybe not ever. Evelyn, can I ask you something as a friend rather than your attorney?" "Of course. Do you miss them at all, despite everything that happened?" I looked out at the harbor where yachts bobbed gently in the evening breeze, their lights beginning to twinkle as darkness approached. Did I miss the family dinners where I'd been tolerated rather than welcomed? Did I miss the constant requests for money disguised as loving concern? Did I miss being treated like an ATM with inconvenient emotions? "I miss who I thought they were," I said finally. "I miss the family I believed we were before I realized they saw me as an embarrassment and a bank account rather than a person worth respecting." "They're learning what life costs without your subsidies. Marcus had to take a job with a smaller firm. Sarah's had to sell her car and move to a smaller apartment. They're discovering that the lifestyle they thought they'd earned was actually a gift they'd taken for granted." Part of me felt sorry for them. Part of me remembered the little boy who used to climb into my lap for bedtime stories and the daughter who used to call me every Sunday just to chat. But those people had been replaced by adults who calculated my worth in monthly transfers rather than measuring it in decades of unconditional love. "Maybe struggling will teach them something valuable," I said. "Maybe learning to support themselves will give them self-respect they've never earned." After hanging up, I walked to the terrace railing and looked down at the harbor where people were beginning their evening activities. Couples strolling hand in hand, families sharing gelato, friends laughing over dinner at waterfront cafes. Normal people living normal lives without the complication of inherited wealth or entitled relatives. Tomorrow, I had appointments to view apartments for sale in the most exclusive buildings in Monaco. Permanent residences where I could build whatever remained of my life according to my own preferences. Where neighbors would know me as Madame Morrison, who paid her bills promptly and minded her own business, rather than the embarrassing grandmother who'd been too generous for too long. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd finally found family in the staff at the hotel who treated me with consistent kindness, in the yacht captain who shared stories of his adventures, in the casino dealers who celebrated my wins and commiserated with my losses. These people were paid to be polite, but their warmth felt more genuine than the calculated affection I'd received from blood relatives. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, probably Sarah or Marcus trying yet another approach. I deleted it without reading, and instead ordered champagne from room service. Not because I was celebrating, but because I'd learned that happiness wasn't something to postpone until you'd satisfied everyone else's expectations. The champagne arrived with fresh strawberries and a note from the hotel manager thanking me for choosing the Hermitage as my temporary home. Temporary had become indefinite, and indefinite was beginning to feel permanent. For the first time in decades, permanent felt like possibility rather than obligation. As Monaco settled into evening around me, lights twinkling from casino windows and yacht decks, I realized I'd finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. Alone was sitting on a terrace with champagne and strawberries, answering to no one but yourself. Lonely was sitting in a house full of people who saw you as a means to an end rather than a person worth knowing. I raised my glass to the Mediterranean sunset, to the bridges I'd burned and the future I was building from their ashes. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is teach them your value by removing it from their reach. Sometimes the most generous gift you can give yourself is the permission to spend your own money on your own happiness. The wealthy grandma who'd been disowned by her own family had found something better than reconciliation. She'd found herself 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, sipping champagne while they learned what life cost without her subsidies. And she was just getting started. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.